Hey gang, it's Graham. What's crackin'? This is my review of a book called A Stranger Among Saints by one Jonathan Mack. Alright, so ever since one video that I put on YouTube accidentally blew up and got 100,000 views and got me 800 followers last year, I decided to do a little bit more reading into passengers on the Mayflower. Doubtless you guys have heard me talk about this one a number of times over the years. The primary source that I used for that video was Caleb H. Johnson and his book, The Mayflower and Her Passengers, which was pretty much just like an encyclopedia of them. Some of the entries were long, based on if they were central figures in the voyage and in the colony after they arrived, versus if they died early and not much was known about them anyway, then the entry's pretty short. I think there might even be one or two where it's a male passenger whose name started with J and was in his 20s, things like that. But among the ones that have pretty detailed and documented lives, there was one, Stephen Hopkins, who was pretty important because he'd been on similar voyages before, and he had a lot to contribute, which I had read of. But prior to reading this book, A Stranger Among Saints, I didn't understand the extent to which he contributed to the colony and to which he may have contributed. Let me elaborate. So Caleb H. Johnson wrote a book that was also specifically about Hopkins, but I didn't want to read that one if I was going to read a book on Hopkins, just because I've already read Johnson's book. I want to read somebody else's research on this particular passenger, because I imagine that Johnson's book on Hopkins would just be more of the same but in greater detail. So trying to vary my sources a little bit, and that's what brought me to Mack's book, which came out last fall. But right up front, the big advantage that the Mayflower passengers had in bringing Hopkins was that he had been to the New World before, specifically on the famous voyage with the Sea Venture, which was headed to Jamestown in the very, very early part of the 1600s. If you saw the Disney movie Pocahontas, he was on that ship with John Smith and John Rolfe. Definitely don't watch Pocahontas with a shred of historical accuracy in your crosshairs, because damn. John Smith was definitely an adventurer in real life, but he's one of those dudes who it's kind of hard to confirm the details of his exploits, because the only source that we have about them is John Smith. And as Charles Mann pointed out in his book 1493, you'll notice that he tells the same story with just different figures and places in it a lot of the times. I went to this place and there was this group of native people and the local leader didn't like me, but his hot daughter was all about me, and even though they almost killed me, she's like, "No, Daddy, don't kill him, I love him so much." And then I hooked up with her, and then I went to the next place and they had a leader who didn't like me, but his hot daughter was totally into me, and he was going to kill me, but then his daughter was like, "No, Daddy." And, repeat ad nauseum. He had this happening in Turkey, he had it happening somewhere else in Eastern Europe, and then, lo and behold, he tells the same story again among the Powhatan people in Virginia, where the Jamestown colony was. And in real life, it was John Rolfe who married Pocahontas and went back to England with her, and then she got sick, and before they could make a return voyage to North America, she passed away. But that's a whole separate story. Like I say, it's just relevant because Stephen Hopkins was on that voyage. He was credited with committing an act of mutiny during their shipwreck in the Caribbean. The details of that are in the book. I won't divulge the entire thing here. But it wasn't like he was just being an uppity, disruptive passenger. He had a legal question based on the legal charter that they received from the King of England, from King James. And this is where questions of legal governance come into mind, and which country's soil you're on, and, do we have to abide by the orders of this king if we land on soil in this country, and so on and so forth. Questions that we're still asking today based on, nationality and sovereignty and borders and law and whatnot. Hey, imagine that. We in the 21st century are not dealing with legal issues of our kind for the first time. But they got the ship fixed. They went up the eastern coast of North America, landed in Virginia, did the whole Jamestown bit, and then Stephen Hopkins traveled back to England. Then you've got the whole bit with the religious separatists, the ones that called themselves saints, and the ones who weren't religious separatists but wanted to travel to North America, and those were what the saints referred to as strangers. Hence the title, A Stranger Among Saints. Stephen Hopkins wasn't one of these religious colonists. He was effectively a stranger, but his fate was intertwined with that of the eponymous saints. The reason why the Mayflower passengers hired him to be their guide in the New World was they were actually aiming for Jamestown. Their plan was to go there. And they wanted somebody who'd been there before, who knew the lay of the land. And they were originally going to hire John Smith, but he was too forceful of a personality, and they were afraid that if he got there, he would try to take charge of everything and just put everybody under his own control. And that would kind of defeat the purpose of escaping a monarch that wasn't allowing you to practice your religion according to the dictates of your own conscience anyway. And so they hired Hopkins, who may not have been as skilled of a woodsman and a mariner and all that stuff as John Smith, but he was also more amenable to their cause and had a little bit less ego, and so he was their guide. As an added advantage, which is one thing that Mack emphasizes in this book that I hadn't read in other accounts of Hopkins, is he had a familiarity with Powhatan's language. You know, while he was there at Jamestown, he learned the language of that particular tribe of Indians, which was under the umbrella of the Algonquin language tree, and would have therefore been similar to, adjacent to, the language spoken by the Wampanoags up the coast in Massachusetts, where the Mayflower ultimately landed. So Hopkins, when they finally did make contact with an Abenaki, what the frick was his title? It wasn't a sachem. What was Samoset? Sagamore. He was something similar to a chief, but like a sub-chief, sub-sachem. When they met Samoset, his English was pretty broken, but in addition to his broken English, he was also able to converse with Hopkins in a limited form of the Algonquin tongue, and that is what contributed to the Pilgrims being able to communicate with the first local that they finally met. And this is where this particular book, Stranger Among Saints, kind of diverts from a Hopkins-centric narrative and focuses more on the first couple of years of the Mayflower Pilgrims, the Plymouth colony, and their dealings with the local natives. And man, it's just so different from the bullet point version that you got in public school, which is, I've said this before, I get why public school only touches on individual events very briefly, just because there's a massive scope of stuff to cover. But the details, this is one of those stories where the details of it are so fascinating and enlightening that it's worth the time that it takes to read a couple of books on this subject to get a complete picture of it. I'm going to plug again here, Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick. Excellent narrative on this group of people and their doings in the New World, but that one's got a much larger scope that covers everything from who the Pilgrims were, why they left Europe to come to North America, and then the next 50, 60 years leading into what ultimately was known as King Philip's War, which Mack also touches on that in this book, but he doesn't focus on every little bit of minutia leading up to King Philip's War, which, the King Philip figure was one of Chief Massasoit's sons, who had a Wampanoag name and also had an English name. It gets complicated. Mack kind of wraps up that part of the narrative. Not that he wraps it up, rather he focuses more on Hopkins' life and brings the book, at the end of the book, he kind of brings it to a close, again, talking about the final details of Hopkins' life, his family, the women that he had married, because he was a widower once or twice, the kids that he had, making sure that they were taken care of, how Miles Standish took care of his kids after Hopkins passed away. Hopkins passed away well before the King Philip's War, and so he wasn't a part of that. He wasn't party to it. He didn't see it go on, but So it doesn't make up a large part of this particular story. But I would say that Mack's book focuses more on Hopkins at the beginning and at the end, but like the middle 60% maybe is more about the Mayflowers and the Plymouth colony in general, which he brought some new information to light that didn't really stick with me during my readings of Philbrick's book or other books that I've read on that subject. So it being November and it being the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, last year you guys will remember me hyping the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower voyage, that makes this a very topical and timely book to read. One of the frequent, I wouldn't say frequent, it popped up a couple of times, kind of comments that I saw on my YouTube video about the Mayflower Passengers was, most of it was people chiming in with, like, oh, I found out I'm related to this person or that person, and I'd throw in a couple of details like, oh, here's what I know about them, but I didn't cover it in the video, and yada yada yada. But you'd get the occasional dunce who would just jump in like, oh, all these people were racist. Oh, that ship should have sunk, and critical race theory crap like that. They weren't racist. They were there to worship their god. The strangers were there for purposes of getting their footing started in a new world. They didn't have the brightest of futures and prospects over in Europe, so they came here. But these people weren't coming here to start crap with anybody, least of all the natives that they kept trying to meet so that they could build good relations with them. And it was the Wampanoags that wanted nothing to do with them. Granted, this was based on prior experience that the Wampanoags had with other Europeans, namely some French slavers that came over in the mid-1610s, and an English slaver named Thomas Hunt, who was responsible for capturing Squanto and some of his Patuxet compatriots and trying to sell them into slavery in Europe. So it wasn't like the Wampanoags' wariness of Europeans was completely unfounded, but there was a reason why they didn't want to meet the Pilgrims and constantly use their knowledge of the territory and the lay of the land to remain hidden from them, because they just didn't want anything to do with them. They didn't want to mess around with it until Samoset had met them, talked to them, found out that they weren't there for gold and riches, but rather they were there, to live, and they had brought their women and children with them, and that was what opened up Sachem Massasoit to saying, okay, well, maybe I will meet with them and we'll see what's going on and we'll go from there. And it was Governor John Carver who entered into a treaty of mutual friendship and protection with the Wampanoags that his successors Bradford and Winslow honored for many years to come. And it was only after both of those leaders on both sides had died that the succeeding generations entered into problems. Now, granted, it was only a couple of short years before the numbers of Europeans in Plymouth colony started to multiply, and some of them started creating problems, namely men that came on ships the following years, which is stuff that's detailed in Philbrick's account of the Plymouth colony. But the point is that it is a very 21st century, let me score points on the internet type view to just say, oh, look, there was those white people that came and screwed everything up, and Thanksgiving is a racist holiday, and we need to tackle the troubled history of this. Bull crap. Like, I'm not going to sit there and say that the Native Americans didn't get a raw deal, because they obviously did. But to sit there and say that, oh, every group of Europeans that came over screwed over every group of kumbaya, peace-loving Native Americans, it's like they gave as good as they got, and when it came time for open warfare, things just got ugly. And this is another subject that Mack covered pretty well in this book, explaining, like, this is who we knew did X on this date on behalf of the Englishmen, and this is who we knew did Y on this date on behalf of whatever Native American tribe. Like, it comes down to the actions of single people that started this beef and dished out that beef, and everybody else on this side of the line said, well, it wasn't the Billingtons that did this, it was the white people that did this. And then the other one said, well, it wasn't the Nausetts that did this, it was those Indians that did this. And all of a sudden, we're in a state of war. Learn from this kind of stuff. Learn the actual details of it And when I say learn from it, I mean, implement positive changes, implement things that you would do differently, and say, okay, let's take the facts into account, have a factual observation of history, and don't do this kind of stuff again in the future. Is that so freaking hard to do? Because if we're just going to sit there and say, okay, well, because this group was wronged by this group, I'm allowed to hate this group. Like, if your focus is on who you're allowed to hate and who you're allowed to dish it out to, you're doing it wrong. And you're not doing anything new. You're just keeping this crap going. And that is very much against the specific spirit of the holiday of Thanksgiving, which ought to be a day of gratitude, a day of humility, a day of peace, and a day of goodwill. And that is very apparent after an honest and thorough study of the history of this holiday, how it came to be, why we celebrate it, and what it should mean to all of us. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on this particular book and on this subject. So check out A Stranger Among Saints by Jonathan Mack and read more about this man, Stephen Hopkins, and his contributions to the very earliest and longest standing settlements in North America. That's it. Be safe. Be rad. Be you out there. Ha! Got it.